It is 7 o'clock. Good to see you this morning. Waking up under curfew in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, following a new warning from the US president about Russia's possible intentions with chemical weapons. Small Business Minister Paul Scully will be joining us on the show in just a few moments' time. I'll also be speaking to the former head of the British Army, Lord Dannatt, and the former Foreign Secretary, Lord Straw. Plus, amidst calls for the government to act after P&O sacked hundreds of staff, I'll be asking the General Secretary of the TUC what more, if anything, can be done. It is Tuesday, the 22nd of March. Clamping down, Russian troops turn on peaceful protesters in the occupied city of Paterson. Living in the shadows, we report from Kharkiv, a city under attack where underground trains have become makeshift homes.
How long have you been living here?
Three weeks.
How do you feel about it?
So first, when we hear something blow up, we run here, but now we're like, what was that? Oh, shooting.
A very good morning from Odessa in South Ukraine, a city which saw its first shelling from a Russian warship, as President Biden warns Russia against the use of chemical weapons.
He's already used chemical weapons in the past, and we should be careful what's about to come.
Deadline day. Bosses at ferry company P&O have until this afternoon to tell the government exactly why they sacked 800 staff. No sign of survivors. We'll be live with rescue teams in southern China after a plane with 132 people on board crashed into mountains. But just why did it happen?
I'm in the mountains of Guangxi in southern China as rescue workers pick their way through the devastation at the crash site.
A tragic incident. A toddler has died after being attacked by a dog her family had only bought a week ago. A royal tribute. Prince William's message to Ukrainians struggling for survival during his tour of the Caribbean.
Today we think of those struggling in Ukraine, and we stand with them in solidarity.
Also ahead on the programme, I'll be joined by the London restaurateur who's taken his pizza oven to Poland to help feed refugee children.
3 years ago, in secret, I started digging a tunnel which would go from my workshop to my house and eventually onto the bunker in the back garden. And this is where we're at.
Tunnel vision. We'll be speaking to the inventor who spent 2 years digging a tunnel under his garden from his house to his shed. But why? We'll tell you at 20 to 10. Morning all. Ukraine's capital is waking up under curfew this morning. The breaking news in the last few minutes from the Ministry of Defence is that Russian forces around the country had a day of limited progress, with most forces largely stalled. Intelligence also suggests that, despite heavy fighting, Ukrainian forces continue to hold off Russian attempts to capture Mariupol. Well, these are the latest developments. A curfew remains in place in the capital, Kiev, until 7 a.m. local time tomorrow. President Biden has warned that Moscow could be considering using chemical weapons. For his part, President Zelensky says that any potential deal agreed in peace negotiations to end the war will be submitted to the Ukrainian people in a referendum. And dozens of Ukrainian orphans and their carers who were due to fly from Poland to the UK on Monday are still stuck in Poland because of missing documentation. Pretty shocking pictures, these. Russian troops reportedly using stun grenades and firing shots to disperse protesters in the occupied city of Kherson. Video showed several hundred pro-Ukrainian protesters in the city's Freedom Square, running as what appeared to be stun grenades landed around them. Loud bangs could be heard, and there are plenty of clouds of smoke. Well, according to Ukrainian officials, at least one person was wounded. Meanwhile, the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov has posted a video on his Telegram page that he says shows Chechen fighters taking part in Russia's offensive against Mariupol. Sky News cannot independently verify the date, location, or indeed conditions under which these images were shot. Chechnya fought unsuccessfully for independence from Russia. Its leader is appointed by Moscow. New satellite imagery released by the private US space technology company Maxar show the scale of the damage that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine's cities. Plumes of smoke can be seen billowing from parts of the northern city of Chernihiv and again in Irpin outside Kiev yesterday. Damage also visible in the encircled port city of Mariupol. President Biden has again warned that Moscow is considering using chemical weapons in its war against Ukraine.
His back is against the wall, and he's talking about new false flags he's setting up, including he's asserting that we, America, have biological as well as chemical weapons in Europe. Simply not true. He's already used chemical weapons in the past, and we should be careful about what's about to come.
Well, Ukraine says it will not surrender its cities and has accused Russia of striking residential areas in its first attack on Odessa. Let's bring in Sky's Nick Martin in that strategic Black Sea port city. Nick, good to see you as always. I mean, two significant developments, I would say. One, President Biden reiterating those concerns about the use of chemical or biological weapons, but where you are, shelling coming from the Russian Navy.
Yeah, it was a significant day yesterday, Neil. Good morning, because it was the first time that the Russian warships that we've been seeing off the coast here in Odessa for a few weeks now, it's the first time that shells fired from those warships actually made contact on the ground. We were talking yesterday morning at that site, which had been struck by about 6 shells, so smashing an apartment block, and it certainly frightened the people there. And I think the general consensus is that this was perhaps the Russian Navy carrying out some sort of test fires to see how close they could come in to the coast and how far inland they could reach their shells, because those shells have a range of about 20 to 25 kilometres depending on the weather conditions, and so it could have been some kind of test of Odessa's defences systems, but it certainly caused a bit of damage. There has been some shelling before at the very beginning of this conflict in the city, and the shelling yesterday was on the outskirts of the city just to the south. But from what I can see here this morning, it's not sent people into a panic. These people are very stoic. They've been spending weeks fortifying their city, and there's cars coming and going. I can see people walking their dogs, and when we go into town in a little bit, I'm sure some of the shops are open. Having said that, there's no complacency. They always expected this port city to be attacked in some form. It is just so strategically important, and yesterday could have been a warning sign of that.
Nick, many thanks indeed. We're once again joined by the Minister for Small Business, Paul Scully. Mr. Scully, great to have you in. And of course, lots to talk about rather closer to your brief, but let's start with that which we are once again seeing in Ukraine. President Biden has once again issued concerns about Russian potential use of biological or chemical weapons. If those were to be used, that would undoubtedly be a war crime, wouldn't it?
Yeah, undoubtedly. And I think, President Biden and the Prime Minister have been really resolute in making sure that we can take every action with the international community to address those crimes of Vladimir Putin. We've got to remember as well with all of this is that this is Vladimir Putin's war against Russia and Kremlin's war against Russia, against Ukraine. It's not the Russian people. So we've got to make sure that we can appeal to the Russian people to bring an end to this.
Those in Ukraine will, of course, be concerned as to whether or not this is President Biden speculating on the basis of, the Russians stall in various parts of the country, or perhaps whether, as has happened on a number of occasions in the past, the Americans are revealing intelligence. Do you know which of those it might be?
I don't know is the honest answer, but, I wouldn't like to speculate.
Cool. Just in terms of the sanctions, there have been a couple of super yachts that have been moved around recently. Italy has been urged to seize the super yacht allegedly linked to Vladimir Putin, the Scheherazade. I mean, is that the type of action that we would wish to see? I mean, there's the boat. I mean, it's pretty big. You can't miss it. I mean, would you support the Italians in taking that type of...
Well, I think what I can talk about is what we've done. We've sanctioned more than 1,000 individuals and entities. We've been very much on the front foot in passing the economic crime bill, which I did last week, which included registering the ownership of the beneficial ownership of properties within the UK, so that we can use that as a tool to better target sanctions against the individuals that are supportive of Putin.
Just on that point, though, I mean, how close are we really to knowing who owns these large empty buildings that we see scattered around Knightsbridge and so on?
Well, I think that's exactly what that register is there to do. What it will do is when people have bought something through a shell company, they will have to register who actually owns it, who's the beneficial owner of it. Now, there's 95,000 odd properties that are involved in that, and most of those clearly are not owned by oligarchs. It's important to remember that many people use those for legitimate reasons, but it will give us a useful tool for the intelligence agencies and enforcement agencies to be able to target the right people.
Yeah, one day I'll have a legitimate reason to own a £50 million mansion. Let's move on to your brief. And in terms of P&O ferries, the accusation has been particularly from those who have been sacked, who haven't signed non-disclosure agreements, is that you heard about it the night before they were told over a Zoom call and did nothing about it. I just want to give you the opportunity to counter that allegation.
No, it's incorrect. I mean, I knew nothing about it, but the Secretary of State was informed the night before that the company was going to be announcing redundancies the following day. Not as in the debate we heard yesterday that there were going to be balaclava wearing security guards or anything like that. And the P&O ferries have made redundancies over the last couple of years, each year over the last couple of years as well, because they are in a not good financial state. And so he expected it to be going along the same way as those redundancies announced previously, rather than the situation that we've seen, the absolutely egregious situation that we've seen.
So just to be absolutely clear, despite the Transport Secretary being told that 800 people were potentially about to lose their jobs, he didn't feel it was necessary for either him or any of his junior ministerial colleagues to pick up the phone and speak to P&O ferries?
Well, what normally happens with redundancies, if you're in a situation when you say there is going to be an announcement, that normally that's an announcement of the consultation, the notification that is required under the law. And bearing in mind that the notification, which is why I and my boss, Kwasi Kwarteng, have written to the chief exec of P&O ferries to get further detail, because it's important that we get the exact detail, not just the various amounts of media stories that we're getting. We need to collate it in one place, because there are criminal sanctions involved in this, so including an unlimited fine for P&O ferries.
Which is all post hoc, unfortunately. The complaint that is being made by the staff is that in those few hours, that window of opportunity, before that Zoom call came and before those sackings were issued, there was an opportunity for the government to speak to P&O ferries. Now, I understand that after the fact, when you've heard all of these details, you're utterly aghast. But surely, before the announcement was made, should have been the opportunity for this government to put in a check call. It doesn't even have to be a minister; a civil servant could have done it.
I mean, to be fair, just the hours that we had before was not even enough time to step up a Department of Work and Pensions team, let alone actually try to reverse the decision. But nonetheless, we have said to P&O ferries, first thing, get round the table, reverse the decision, speak to the unions, speak to the workers.
But it is perfectly possible that what P&O ferries have done is entirely legal. They're not flagged in the United Kingdom. They sail in international waters. The allegation is that they have hired Indian agency staff on less than £2 an hour, and it could potentially be perfectly legal. There is nothing as of 7 o'clock this morning to stop another company from doing exactly this if they're operating in similar circumstances to P&O ferries.
Well, this is the complication. It's about jurisdiction. A lot of this is about jurisdiction. As you say, it was the vessel isn't flagged within the UK. I understand that contracts may not have been signed within the UK. Either, and this is all the things that we're trying to determine. Nonetheless, the point still stands. If it is a business on land in the UK, within your UK jurisdiction, there are plenty of laws in place which carry criminal sanctions.
Are we going to change the law, though, to prevent firing and rehiring?
Well, this wasn't really a case of fire and rehire, because
it said in the memo circulated by the DfT that their ambition was to fire and rehire at more favourable conditions. That was in the civil servant's note.
But the ambition was to rehire other people. So there was, you've got 800 people sitting now in the UK without a job that had no opportunity of going back to a job, and that's why that consultation is so important. But this was a case of mass sackings that were done in the most callous way.
OK, so what are we going to do about it?
So, as I say, we're establishing the facts now. We're expecting an answer.
If it proves that they haven't acted illegally, if they haven't acted illegally under English law, maritime law, what are we going to do?
Well, look, if they have, then what we absolutely reserve the right to approach prosecuting authorities to tackle this. If we haven't, then obviously we want to make sure that we can support the 800 people who have lost their jobs to make sure that they can get back into good work. But we'll have to work with international partners because this is, as you say, a complex web of international maritime law when you have vessels flagged with other countries.
I do want to take you away from your brief again. We'll return to it just at the end. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe spoke very movingly yesterday about her years in incarceration and, indeed, her complaint that successive foreign secretaries could have sorted this out. If, as we were told by Liz Truss the other day, that this was a debt, that this was an obligation that we had to the Iranians of £400 million, there or thereabouts, if that was a debt that we owed on the last day of her incarceration, it was a debt that we owed on the first day of her incarceration. So I will ask again the question that she asked. Why didn't we pay it before now?
Well, look, first of all, it was such a pleasure to see Nazanin.
Indeed.
And looking in such good shape as well. I'd seen her after all she's been through. I'd seen Richard throughout both of his hunger strikes, and you know he really suffered, as did she, as did her family. So it's lovely to see her back. But clearly, what we had to do, the government had to do, is to make sure that yes, it was a debt that was there to be paid. It was worked in parallel, but it was a complex situation to make sure that debt worked alongside sanctions from a number of countries around the world with Iran. That was, you know, it's not something that was relatively easy to sort out. But
you rewind to December 2017 when one Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary and was trying to secure Nazanin's release. You know, the line from Downing Street at that point was there was absolutely no link between the debt and Nazanin's incarceration. In fact, it was only in May 2019 the Sunday Times went to court to get documents published that showed that this debt was at the heart of it. So, again, we also learnt that year that two Defence Secretaries, Sir Michael Fallon and Gavin Williamson, remember him, had also said no to a Foreign Office request for the money to be paid out of the defence budget. There were opportunities over the 6 years for this money to be paid, and the government chose not to do so. So doesn't Nazanin have a point?
I think that, as I say, the debt and her release were run in parallel, but there is
just a coincidence that they took place on the same day.
Well, there's a complex set of approaches with the international community. When you've got the US with sanctions against Iran, when you've got us with sanctions against Iran, it's very, very difficult to have those any closer together for fear of what otherwise might happen in a similar situation, given kidnaps, given ransoms and stuff in other parts of the world.
Again, though, Nazanin's line is, if this money had anything to do with my release 6 years into my incarceration, why could it not have been done earlier? You can understand her.
No, I can understand her frustration.
Yeah.
Crikey, what she's gone through is horrendous, so I can totally understand her frustration. And as I say, having met Richard a few times, I've seen the pain and anguish of the family over that period as well. So all I can do now she is back, and I'm really pleased she's back, and I'm glad that Liz Truss acted the way she did and got her out resolutely, that she can put this behind her somehow and rebuild that time with her family.
We have 30 seconds left in the interview, so I suspect you're not going to give me all the details of the spring statement tomorrow. So why don't you at least tell me what it is going to be designed to achieve?
Well, look, we've got a lot of headwinds that everybody's facing, businesses and individuals as well. And it's so important that the Chancellor will be looking at the public finances in the round to make sure he can continue to flex and support people in difficult times.
Minister, great to have you on. Thanks for being with us. Why don't we have a quick look at the papers? We'll start with the Times. It focuses on Mariupol, saying that Vladimir Putin is threatening civilians to try and break their spirit. The Telegraph has a picture of what it believes is Putin's £500 million super yacht. It is quite super, isn't it? It says it could be seized by authorities in Italy as part of sanctions against Russia. Sorry, I just fell over the set. While The Guardian reveals what it says are billions of dollars of assets around the world linked with Russians with alleged ties to President Putin. The Mail reports that the man on trial for the murder of the MP, Sir David Amess, had allegedly staked out other MPs and even cabinet ministers as possible targets. Now, just a little later, we will have a special report from our correspondent John Sparks in Kharkiv, where civilians have made underground carriages into makeshift homes.
How do you feel about it?
So first, when we hear something blow up, we run here, but now we're like, what was that? Oh, shooting.
Here.
Well, after 4 weeks of almost unrelenting Russian bombing, this is the new normal for Ukrainians in Kharkiv, many of whom are looking after babies. Oh dear. One mother we spoke to said that the trauma of living in this war zone will stay with her forever. It's a tough but important watch, so please do stay tuned for John's full report.
2 days after the invasion.
A pro-Kremlin tabloid has removed a post on their website saying that 14,000 Russian troops have been killed and 16,000 wounded in the war in Ukraine. The publication now claims its site was hacked and that the information that was posted was fake. Russia's last casualty report 3 weeks ago said that nearly 500 soldiers had died. Well, here we have some social media footage of anti-war protesters attempting to blockade a yacht belonging to the sanctioned Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich from leaving its dock. A group of people with Ukrainian flags boarded a small dinghy to try and prevent the £430 million yacht from departing Turkey's Aegean Sea resort of Bodrum. Turkey has not sanctioned Russia for invading Ukraine. Still to come on the programme, well, as Russia continues its indiscriminate bombing campaign, where is this war heading next? After past, we'll speak to the former Armed Forces Chief, Lord Darrant. I'll also be speaking to the campaigner Brendan Cox on calls for the government to create a new Survivors Charter 5 years on from the Westminster Bridge terror attack. And after 8, we'll be hearing from Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Now, China's aviation authority said it was travelling from the city of Kunming to Guangzhou, a journey of over 600 miles. The plane came down in mountains near the city of Wuzhou. Emergency services at the crash site have now found some debris in a heavily forested area, but still no sign of any survivors. Our Asia correspondent Tom Cheshire reports from near the accident site.
This is a small village, quite a long way from Wuzhou, the nearest city. It shows you how remote this region is, and this is the centre, a makeshift centre for the search and rescue operation. We've seen people streaming in and out towards the crash site. But we arrived here to the sad news that there are no survivors from this plane crash. That has changed the nature of the operation here. What they'll be doing now is going to that mountain, picking through any debris, and it looks like tiny pieces of debris, such was the force of the impact, to try and put together what happened to this China Eastern flight, because it is a mystery at the moment. This flight was cruising along yesterday in nice weather conditions, nothing to worry about, and it suddenly plummeted from the sky at an extraordinary rate of speed. It managed to pull up a little bit and then dive back into the ground. That shouldn't happen to a modern airplane. So the investigation will be looking at why. There will be focus, of course, on the manufacturer of the plane, Boeing, especially given the history of the two 787 MAX crashes. This was a different sort of plane, but nonetheless China Eastern, which is a state-owned carrier, one of China's 3 flagship carriers really, has grounded all its Boeing 787-8s. Boeing has said it will cooperate with the Chinese Civil Aviation Administrative investigation. There are still relatives gathering in the airports, Kunming and Guangzhou, where the flight took off from and where it was headed to, seeking answers, but they have got one very grim answer already. The fact that there are no survivors on this plane crash, 132 souls on board that flight, which crashed into the mountains just over there.
Well, some newspapers are reporting that this image of a plane nosediving is the plane in question in southern China. We, however, cannot independently verify this image. The Sun here showing the image of the plane almost vertical in descent. Some other news now. And 2 people have died after an attack at a secondary school in Malmö in Sweden. An 18-year-old student was arrested on suspicion of murder. It's not yet clear what happened, but the police have confirmed there were no reports of gunfire. A new study has found the number of prescriptions written for anti-anxiety medication have risen sharply. Researchers from the University of Bristol found that women are almost twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with anxiety. Prince Andrew, remember him? Well, he's planning to attend the Duke of Edinburgh's memorial service, according to reports. The Duke of York, who recently settled Virginia Giuffre's civil sex claim against him, will reportedly attend the Westminster Abbey next week, honouring his father. Many members of the royal family, the Queen included, are expected to attend. Meanwhile, Prince William has expressed his solidarity with people in Ukraine. He was speaking on a visit to a military base in Belize during his tour of the Caribbean. This report from Sky's royal correspondent Rhiannon Mills does contain flash photography.
The last royal to come to the ruins at Cahill Petch was the Queen. In her Platinum Jubilee year, her grandson and granddaughter-in-law were the ones delivering her warm wishes.
Long live the Queen. Que viva la reina.
William used the moment to recall his grandmother's words of praise for Belize in 1994, to then condemn the horrors taking place in Ukraine.
She said, "I am proud to associate myself with your determination that social justice and personal freedom should flourish under the rule of law. It is always dangerous, however, to be complacent and to assume that democratic values will look after themselves. Vigilance in protecting them is needed. Sadly, elsewhere in the world, that vigilance is being tested today in Ukraine. Belize has joined many others in condemning the invasion and standing up for the principles of international law, peace, and security. Today we think of those struggling in Ukraine, and we stand with them in solidarity.
It was a reminder these tours aren't all about sightseeing after their morning among the Mayan ruins at Caracol. The couple standing on the Sky Palace, still the largest man-made structure in Belize, was the picture, until they were joined by some of us.
You're in each other's photos.
These pictures are priceless for the people of Belize. A tour brings immense global attention, and a stage the royal couple know they can also personally use to deliver the messages that matter so much to them. Rhiannon Mills, Sky News in Belize.
Now, you may remember this incredible moment in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Sweet. 7-year-old Amelia captured hearts when she sang Let It Go from the movie Frozen, in Ukrainian, of course, in her bomb shelter. Well, you might want to take a look at her now. She performed the national anthem at a charity concert in Poland. The little girl escaped Ukraine 3 weeks ago with her grandmother and siblings. Her mother and father, though, have stayed behind in Kiev. Sweet little girl. Now, I wonder if you can tell which of these incredibly famous works of art is set to fetch millions at auction. Well, let's have a quick look. Christie's Auction House has announced that it's going to sell not the Mona Lisa, not the self-portrait, not the Scream, but down there, bottom right, 1964 Andy Warhol silkscreen of Marilyn Monroe. How much? $200 million, which would make it the most expensive 20th century artwork ever to sell at auction. Well, the painting comes to Christie's from a healthcare foundation for children, and all of the proceeds of the sale are supposed to be going towards it. Good for them. Stay right where you are. Coming up next, we'll discuss the state of the conflict in Ukraine with the former head of the Armed Forces, General Lord Richard Dannett. News reaching us from the Metropolitan Police Force. Officers investigating the death of Sabita Thanwani in Clerkenwell have now charged a man with murder. He's been named as Maher Maroof, 22 years old, of no fixed address, due to appear in court a little bit later on today. Of course, detectives were called to Clerkenwell, to Arbour House in Sebastian Street at about 5:10 in the morning on Saturday. 19-year-old Sabita had been found suffering from serious injuries. She was, however, pronounced dead at the scene. Police today announcing that they have now charged a man with her murder. But let's just remind you as to our top stories. Russian troops have turned on peaceful protesters in the occupied city of Paterson. We have a special report from Kharkiv, a city under attack where underground trains have become makeshift homes. And bosses at the ferry company P&O have until this afternoon to tell the government why they sacked 800 staff. Well, a short while ago, I asked the Small Business Minister, Paul Scully, why the government didn't act to stop the redundancies. He told me he knew nothing about it.
The Secretary of State was informed the night before that the company was going to be announcing redundancies the following day. Not as in the debate we heard yesterday that there were going to be balaclava wearing security guards or anything like that. And the P&O ferries have made redundancies over the last couple of years, each year over the last couple of years as well, because they are in a not good financial state. And so he expected it to be going along the same way as those redundancies announced previously, rather than the situation that we've seen, the absolutely egregious situation that we've seen.
Our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, is back in the studio. Of course, P&O have a deadline. They're calling it a deadline, but they're saying, let us know by this time as to why they've done all this. But, you know, putting it to the minister, the biggest complaint that has been made is that they knew and they did nothing about it. And to an extent, we didn't really get any pushback on that.
No, yesterday, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, conceded that the government had been told at least 12 hours before these 800 workers were summarily sacked in a quick Zoom call on Thursday last week. But what the government says is that the proper procedure probably wasn't followed, because you're supposed to liaise with unions, you're supposed to give the government notice through a different outlet, so that all the procedures may not have been followed properly. And as Paul Scully was telling you, there wouldn't have even been enough time in 12 hours to set up a team to speak to them, let alone reverse the decision entirely. But this issue is not going to go away. The chief executive of P&O was told by the business secretary to respond to 10 different questions about why this happened, where the workers are, why this didn't happen in other countries where P&O have staff like France and Holland. We expect Peter Hebblethwaite to get back to them by 5 p.m. today, and we may well hear more from ministers today. But so far, we've had a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of it's appalling and egregious and terrible. But what certainly Labour, what the trade unions, what staff in other similar companies, maybe owned by a foreign company as its parent company, want to know is, how is this going to be stopped from happening again to other workers?
Tamara, thank you. Let's return to Ukraine, where for many, life is certainly getting harder. In Kharkiv, families are living in underground rail carriages to avoid the Russian shelling. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second city and around 25 miles from the border with Russia. Our correspondent John Sparks has this report, which does contain images of injured people.
The streets of Kharkiv have been abandoned by the majority of those who live here. 500,000 have fled this city, their prized possessions in a bag, and their cars discarded at the station. Those who remain hide in the shadows, in the dark, or the deep underground. More than a dozen metro stations have been turned into shelters. These battered-looking train carriages redeployed as home.
How long have you been living here?
3 weeks.
How do you feel about it?
So first, when we hear something blow up, we're around here, but now we're like, what was that? Oh, shooting.
The experience is a trial for a new mother called Natalia. She gave birth to her son 2 days after the invasion began. The hospital then sent her here.
За малышом здесь вообще ухаживать очень тяжело. Мы с мамой ходим к главной подстанции, моем его там. Ну, вообще неудобно. Поэтому хочется, чтобы скорее все закончилось и вернуться домой.
They now live in the final car on platform 2, with a cot and clothes provided by volunteers. Natalia says life will never be the same again.
Мне кажется, что даже если когда отсюда я выйду, я не буду уже спокойно ходить, как ходила раньше, буду 300 раз оборачиваться и буду бояться, даже когда стреляет фейерверк, вот честно могу сказать. Ну, это очень страшно.
Residents who remain will try to endure, but some are no longer able. The city morgue receives 50 to 100 bodies a day caused by the war and by natural causes. When a Russian missile struck this institute, the entire neighborhood was damaged in the blast. 85-year-old Stella Ivanovna told us she hung on to the doorframe in the hope she'd survive.
What was it like when the bombing happened, when the missile hit?
Я была в квартире и шла с большой комнаты в маленькую. Дошла до двери, вот так встала, и оно полетело, как снег, с этой стороны, с этой. Все окна, все стекла, потолки. Я не знаю, как я осталась жива.
Sergei is an opera singer turned volunteer who was shot 7 times as he tried to evacuate local residents.
На спині ще, просто біля хребта, взагалі там міліметр. І, уявіть, що було, якби куля втрапила, буквально міліметр в хребет. Розумієте, тобто, слава Богу, живим.
Who was shooting at you?
Хто у вас стріляв? Ой, я насправді не знаю цього. Насправді не знаю. Але я дуже радий, що я здоровий, бо це ніч, і в Харкові вночі відбувається все, що завгодно просто.
Sergei's body should heal in time, and he's celebrated with an old Italian song of resistance.
La mattina mi son svegliato, ho ritrovato partisan. Ciao.
Death and displacement have come to everybody's doorstep, but there are many here who are determined to hold on. John Sparks, Sky News, Kharkiv.
Well, Russia's advance on the capital, Kiev, has stalled in the face of fierce Ukrainian resistance. Let's speak now to the former heads of British Armed Forces, General Richard Dannett. Lord Dannett, great to have you on the programme once again. I wonder what you make of the evolution in terms of the Russian tactics. In John's report there, we just had further examples of the fortitude of your average Ukrainian, but it's not just the ordinary Ukrainian that's been taking up arms. Their military as well has served to stall the Russian advances pretty significantly.
Yes, you're right. I think John Sparks' film just illustrates very graphically the difficult circumstances in which the Ukrainian people are living. Kharkiv, as the report said, the second largest city in Ukraine, and what's happening there is quite appalling. But part of your introduction is right. Certainly the push by the Russians, that big push down from Belarus towards Kyiv itself, has very much stalled, and there are well-founded reports that in the north and the west of the city, the Russian forces are going on the defensive. They're hunkering down for a long fight for Kyiv, and of course, this is just illustrating the fact that they haven't got the strength, or perhaps even the motivation or the will, to try and push into the center of Kyiv itself. So they are following that medieval practice of standing off and shelling. But while that goes on, both in Kyiv and Kharkiv, which we were seeing, the eye of the storm at the present moment is in the south, around Mariupol. And I think it's very important that we keep a very close eye on what happens to Mariupol. The Ukrainians are desperately determined to defend that and prevent that land link being formed between Crimea all the way through Mariupol, through the Donbass, into Russia itself. And that's absolutely critical, because if that land link is established and the Ukrainian forces have to give up finally Mariupol, it means the Russians will be able to redeploy quite a number of forces, possibly perhaps to threaten Odessa. And bear in mind that the Russians have got a large amphibious force at sea threatening Odessa. So we could see that an attack being made on that last port that would give Ukraine, or it's the last port that gives Ukraine an opportunity to get its exports out into the world shipping lanes. So watching what's happening in the south is really, really important at the present moment.
Well, indeed, but just to pick up on what you described, I think fairly accurately as the medieval tactic of standing off and persisting in, almost continuous artillery shelling. If the Ukrainians continue to resist in the manner in which they do, it looks as if there might not be much of Ukraine left in the not too distant future.
Well, this, of course, is the absolute irony. When Vladimir Putin launched this outrageous invasion, it was with the purpose of, if you like, almost putting an arm around Ukraine and drawing Ukraine into the wider family of Russian people. Well, I don't think many Ukrainians many Ukrainians other than those who live in the most eastern part of the country, in those two eastern republics, but most other Ukrainians have got no interest really now of being part of a greater Russia. And frankly, what even would Russia gain if in apparently taking control of Ukraine, they're just taking over a complete bomb site and destroyed cities? And I think here's another question. Given the historical importance of Kyiv, does even Vladimir Putin want to smash up that historic city? Surely he must want to leave something that he could then parade on the world stage. But the way things are going, the determination of the Ukrainians, the way their civilians are enduring enormous hardship, their military and their volunteers are fighting most courageously. I can see this thing going on for quite some time, unless, of course, a return is made to the negotiating table. And President Zelensky said he's willing to talk, but he must see Vladimir Putin face to face around the table. So one really hopes and prays that happens sooner rather than later. But then, of course, the big issue is what will be on the agenda? Who is prepared to compromise on what? And that looks very difficult at the present moment.
There appears to me to be an awful lot of speculation around ways by which the tempo of this conflict might change. We heard from President Biden just yesterday, again raising the prospect of chemical or biological weapons being used, some suggesting the tempo could change if we see the Belarusians coming in. I do wonder what you make, given your military experience, of the accusations that have come from Zelensky and others of the Russians participating in acts of genocide. Is that a tag, a title, a description that you find particularly useful right now?
Well, we've talked about war crimes for the last month now, and that conversation has almost become commonplace. Undoubtedly, war crimes are being committed on a daily basis. Now, the question is, and this is where international lawyers will start to scratch their heads, at what point do serial war crimes become genocide? Genocide is the systematic elimination of a genus, of a people. And I think Mariupol looks to me increasingly like Srebrenica in 1995. I've given evidence against General Mladic and General Krstić in The Hague, and they were indicted for war crimes. I've also given evidence for Bosnia against Serbia in their genocide trial as well. So we are getting quite close to the accumulation of war crimes, adding up to a deliberate policy of trying to remove and eradicate a people. I mean, this is an appalling prospect, but I think it's right that we are starting to look at that and starting to consider using that language.
Lord Dan, I wonder if we might just step away from the discussion about Ukraine and focus on something that comes close to your role as chair of the National Emergencies Trust. In a few minutes' time, I'm going to be speaking to Brendan Cox about the Survivors Charter. Give us an idea of why a Survivors Charter and your role as chair of the National Emergencies Trust, why that may well be so significant. We understand, of course, that acts of terror cause any amount of mental anguish, but it's rather more than that.
Well, thank you for asking me that question. Of course, we've got two organisations in this country that respond to disasters. The Disasters Emergency Committee, which is doing a fantastic job in raising money for Ukraine, previously for Afghanistan. And then at home, to respond to domestic disasters, we have the National Emergencies Trust, which, as you say, I chair. And 2 years ago, just about now, we launched our appeal. British people raised £100 million, which was distributed around the country to 15,000 charities and community groups. And of course, those groups are made up of people who were struggling in the early days of the pandemic. And it's important to get help to people who are struggling, who are survivors. So I think Brendan Cox is right to come on the programme and to champion a survivors' charter, because, and there's a lot of debate about people who come through awful things. Are they survivors or are they victims? In a sense, that's a slightly semantic conversation. But what it means at the end of the day, when something awful happens, it's on individuals that the focus properly comes, and it's individuals who need help. And the long tail of these tragedies is invariably a mental health tale. So that's a really important area where we need to put more resource, more national resource, more government resource, and more charity resource to help people when something awful has happened. Immediately help is given, but then the implications of that and the memories of all that, my goodness, this will be happening in Ukraine for decades to come, that memory continues, and the mental health that is required with people's mental health is really, really important.
Certainly is. Lord Dannett, great to have you on the programme once again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's bring you a little bit of breaking news, and it relates to the Kremlin critic, Alexei Navalny, poisoned already by the Russian state. That didn't kill him, so they threw him in jail, and now are convicting him of further offences. A court has decided that he is guilty of fraud on a large scale. Russian prosecutors now seek to move Alexei Navalny to a maximum security penal colony. As I understand it, because of this additional conviction, this means that in the eyes of the Russian legal system, he is a recidivist offender, which means he can be put into one of those prisons with, well, rather grimmer conditions than the one that he is already in. Navalny is already serving a 2-year sentence given to him under some pretty speculative, 2.5-year sentence, I should say, for parole violations, which were related to some pretty trumped-up charges designed to thwart his political ambition. Now, around 46 Ukrainian orphans and their carers en route to the UK. Well, where are they currently? They've been left stranded in Poland. Their journey was organised by a Scottish charity, Dnipro Kids, but missing paperwork from the Ukrainian authorities has left them stuck in Warsaw. The children, who come from orphanages in the Dnipro region, have been waiting for the past 2 weeks to fly to the UK. A toddler has died after being attacked by a dog that her family had owned for just a week. Let's speak to our correspondent, Ivor Bennett. Ivor, we have heard this story so many times, but it never fails to shock. Just give us the details as far as we understand them.
Yeah, it's a truly shocking, very tragic story, this. The details are still emerging. What we know so far is the toddler was a girl, just 17 months old, and as you say, the family had owned the dog for just 1 week. The incident happened yesterday afternoon in St Helens at an address on Bidston Avenue. Emergency services attended. The child was taken to hospital where she died from her injuries. We don't know much about the dog. We don't know what breed it was, but the police have said it was destroyed, and they are now going to do some forensic tests to establish what kind of breed it was and whether or not it was a legal breed under the Dangerous Dogs Act.
Ivor, many thanks indeed. Today marks 5 years since the Westminster Bridge attack, in which 6 people died and at least 50 more were injured. In a new report, the Survivors Against Terror group is calling on the government to do more to help survivors of such attacks. Very pleased to say the group's co-founder, Brendan Cox, joins us on the programme. Brendan, great to see you this morning. Just give us an idea of what the Survivors Charter is and indeed what the necessity for it is.
So when we set up Survivors Against Terror a few years ago, I think our assumption was that when this terrible thing happens, when people are bereaved or seriously injured, that they would be looked after. These are high-profile attacks, and you would expect the whole resources of the state to be mobilised to support them. And what we found in a survey of our 300 members was, in fact, that often wasn't happening, that there are too many people who were left languishing on waiting lists for mental health support, for example, people who ended up contemplating suicide, ended up committing self-harm because they weren't getting the basic support that they required. We also heard from people who couldn't afford the basics in life, who had lost their loved one, who brought in, who was the main breadwinner, and simply couldn't afford to stay in their house, or others who couldn't afford to adapt their houses to take a wheelchair that they were then in. So those basic things, that basic level of support we found was lacking. So what we're calling for today is for the government to implement its promise to consult on a survivors' charter. And that's a fancy way of saying a set of guarantees, legal guarantees on things like compensation, on things like access to mental health support, so that when this awful thing happens, when this attack on our state takes place, that those people are properly looked after and supported.
Are there any other countries to which we can look to for inspiration in all of this? We've had our fair share of terror attacks in this country. So too have others, however. Yeah, so what we did in order to inform this charter, back in 2019, the government, Boris Johnson, committed to consult on a survivors' charter. And so what we've done over the last couple of years is to work on an analysis looking at France, looking at Belgium, looking at Australia, New Zealand, Israel, US, Canada, and looking to try to understand what are they getting right that we're getting wrong? What are we getting right that they're getting wrong? And what we found out from that was that there are some countries, places like France, places like Belgium, where they just have a completely different and higher level of support. And that's partly because of the individual areas of support that they offer, but it's also that they have a different attitude. They see terror attacks not as an unfortunate accident that happens to an individual, like a car accident, which is the way that we tend to see it in the UK, but as an attack on the state that requires a response from the state. So in France, for example, these survivors are often treated as if they are veterans, people who are unwilling veterans of a war, and that the state has a particular responsibility. So we think there are real things that we can learn, and that will both have an impact on the survivors themselves, but will also send out an incredibly strong message that in the face of terrorism, we will look after each other. Brendan Cox, we have to leave it there as we are just about out of time, but really appreciate it, and we'll keep your fingers crossed that the government listens. Stay where you are. We will have much more from in and around Ukraine coming next.